Mom, there's hell on the beach. My buddies are dying in the water, bullets everywhere. We're getting into Germany, but the price is too heavy. These blood-stained words were scrawled in a waterlogged field notebook by 19-year-old Private First Class Danny O'Connor from Chicago, Illinois, as he crouched behind a steel beach obstacle on Omaha Beach at 0730 hours on June 6, 1944. His pencil stub clutched in trembling fingers, still numb from the icy waters of the English Channel, scratched across pages soaked with seawater and the blood of fallen comrades as the largest amphibious invasion in human history transformed into a nightmare of machine gun fire, artillery explosions, and American soldiers dying in the surf just yards from Nazi-occupied France. Danny's notebook was discovered in 1984 by French archaeologists excavating German defensive positions along what Allied forces had code-named Omaha Beach during the Normandy invasion. The waterlogged journal, preserved in the sand beneath a collapsed bunker for 40 years, contained the most detailed first-person account of the initial assault waves that suffered 90% casualties during the first hour of D-Day operations. What made Danny's testimony particularly valuable was his position as a radio operator with the 116th Infantry Regiment, giving him a unique perspective on both the tactical disaster unfolding around him and the desperate attempts by American commanders to salvage victory from what appeared to be certain defeat. If these untold stories of American courage during the most crucial battle of World War II fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to our channel because we're bringing you the most powerful first-hand testimonies from D-Day that history has almost forgotten. Private Danny O'Connor had been training for the Normandy invasion since January 1944, participating in endless amphibious assault exercises along the coast of England, while Allied planners refined every detail of Operation Overlord, the massive undertaking designed to establish a second front in Western Europe and begin the liberation of Nazi-occupied territory. His unit, the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division, had been designated to assault the western sector of Omaha Beach, where German defenders had spent 4 years constructing the most formidable coastal fortifications in military history. What Danny and his fellow soldiers couldn't have known was that their landing sector would prove to be the most heavily defended and dangerous stretch of beach in the entire Normandy invasion. The briefings that Danny attended during the weeks leading up to D-Day had painted an optimistic picture of the coming assault, with intelligence officers assuring the troops that preliminary bombardments would destroy most German defensive positions and that resistance would be light to moderate from demoralized enemy forces. Reality would prove devastatingly different as the 352nd Infantry Division, an elite German unit that intelligence had failed to detect, had recently moved into positions overlooking Omaha Beach and was waiting in prepared positions for the American assault that they knew was coming. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest and most desperate battles in American military history. Danny O'Connor had grown up in the Irish neighborhoods of South Chicago, where his father worked as a steelworker and his mother raised 5 children while taking in laundry to help support the family during the depths of the Great Depression. The Army had represented Danny's escape from the economic hardships that had defined his teenage years, offering steady pay, technical training, and the chance to serve his country during the greatest crisis in modern history. His letters home during basic training revealed a serious young man who took pride in mastering the complex radio equipment that would be his responsibility during combat operations, describing in detail the various communication systems that connected infantry companies with artillery support, air cover, and higher headquarters. The radio operator's job was one of the most dangerous in any infantry unit, as enemy forces specifically targeted the distinctive antenna arrays that marked communication personnel for immediate elimination. Danny understood these risks, but had volunteered for radio training because of the additional responsibility and technical challenges involved, as well as the crucial role that communications played in coordinating the complex operations required for successful amphibious assault. His notebook entries from training exercises showed a young soldier who grasped both the importance of his mission and the deadly nature of the work he would be called upon to perform when his unit finally crossed the English Channel to assault Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The months of preparation that preceded D-Day had given Danny and his fellow soldiers confidence that American industrial might and military planning would overcome German defensive preparations. But they had also created unrealistic expectations about what the invasion would actually entail. The practice landings conducted along the English coast had been carried out against minimal opposition and with perfect coordination between the various elements of sea, air, and land forces that would participate in the real assault. What these exercises couldn't simulate was the chaos, confusion, and terror that would characterize the actual landing when German machine gunners and artillery observers began systematically destroying American landing craft before they could reach the beach. Danny's personal motivations for fighting went beyond patriotic duty to include deep anger about Nazi atrocities that had been revealed through newsreels and military briefings showing concentration camps, mass executions, and the systematic destruction of European Jewish communities. His notebook contained several references to his determination to help liberate the victims of Nazi oppression, noting that the invasion represented not just a military operation, but a moral crusade against forces that had threatened to destroy everything Americans valued about freedom and human dignity. These convictions would prove crucial in sustaining his courage during the horror that awaited him on Omaha Beach. The final briefing that Danny attended on June 5, 1944, just hours before the invasion fleet departed English ports, had emphasized the historical significance of the operation and the confidence that Allied commanders placed in their troops' ability to establish the foothold in Western Europe that would eventually lead to Nazi Germany's defeat. General Omar Bradley himself had addressed the assault troops, assuring them that they were the best trained and best equipped soldiers in the world, and that their mission would succeed despite the challenges ahead. What neither Bradley nor his staff could have anticipated was that German defensive preparations had far exceeded Allied intelligence estimates, and that the preliminary bombardments would prove largely ineffective against deeply buried fortifications. Have you ever wondered how young American soldiers found the courage to charge across an open beach under machine gun fire, knowing that they were likely to die but understanding that the future of freedom itself depended on their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory? The crossing of the English Channel during the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, represented both the culmination of 2 years of Allied planning and the beginning of the most desperate battle that American forces would fight in the European theater. Danny O'Connor spent the 5-hour voyage aboard Landing Craft Infantry 491, one of dozens of assault vessels carrying the first wave of troops toward Omaha Beach and seas, roughened by the storm that had delayed the invasion by 24 hours. His notebook entries from the crossing captured both the seasickness that affected nearly every soldier aboard the cramped landing craft and the growing tension as the coast of Nazi-occupied France appeared through the pre-dawn darkness ahead of their heavily loaded vessel. The preliminary bombardment that was supposed to destroy German defensive positions began at 0550 hours, with Allied naval forces and Royal Air Force bombers conducting what appeared to be a devastating attack on enemy fortifications along the Norman coast. Danny wrote about watching the massive explosions that lit up the sky above their target beach, noting with satisfaction that the German positions seemed to be taking a terrific pounding that would surely eliminate most resistance before American troops reached the shore. What he couldn't see from his position aboard the landing craft was that most of the bombs and shells were falling inland rather than on the beach fortifications themselves, leaving the carefully prepared German defensive positions largely intact and ready to greet the incoming assault with devastating fire. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came at 0630 hours, when the leading wave of amphibious tanks that were supposed to provide fire support for the infantry assault began sinking in the rough seas before they could reach the beach. Danny watched in horror as Sherman tanks equipped with flotation devices disappeared beneath the waves, taking their crews with them and eliminating the heavy weapons support that assault troops would desperately need to suppress German machine gun positions. Of the 32 amphibious tanks launched toward Omaha Beach, only 5 would successfully reach the shore, leaving the infantry to face prepared defensive positions without the armored support that Allied planners had counted on to ensure success. The actual landing began at 0630 hours under conditions that immediately revealed the inadequacy of Allied intelligence and planning for the Omaha Beach assault. As Danny's landing craft approached the beach, German artillery observers began directing accurate fire onto the incoming boats, scoring direct hits that killed entire squads before they could disembark and begin their advance toward the bluffs that dominated the landing zone. The planned coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and ground assault completely broke down as enemy fire forced landing craft to discharge their troops in deeper water and further from their intended targets than anyone had anticipated. Danny's first experience of combat came not on the beach itself, but in the surf, as machine gun fire from German positions caught American soldiers while they were still wading through waist-deep water toward shore. His notebook entry for 0645 hours, written while crouched behind a steel beach obstacle with bullets whistling overhead, captured the shock and terror of soldiers who had trained for 2 years, but were unprepared for the intensity and accuracy of German defensive fire. He wrote about watching his squad leader, Sergeant Mike Kowalski from Detroit, take a machine gun burst in the chest and disappear beneath the waves, leaving his radio operator alone and without clear orders in the middle of the most crucial battle of the war. The psychological impact of witnessing mass casualties during the first minutes of the assault proved almost as devastating as the physical losses themselves, as soldiers who had expected to advance rapidly inland found themselves pinned down on a narrow strip of beach under continuous fire from positions they couldn't see or effectively engage. Danny documented the growing panic and confusion as company and platoon organization disintegrated under fire, with many officers and non-commissioned officers killed or wounded during the initial landing, leaving small groups of soldiers scattered along the beach without leadership or clear objectives. By 0700 hours on June 6, 1944, the assault on Omaha Beach had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, as American forces found themselves trapped on a narrow strip of sand between the advancing tide and German defensive positions that commanded every approach to the bluffs overlooking the landing zone. Danny O'Connor's radio had been damaged during the landing, cutting off communication with the naval forces offshore and eliminating any possibility of coordinating effective fire support against the machine gun nests and artillery positions that were systematically destroying American landing craft as they attempted to discharge additional waves of troops. His notebook entries from this period captured the helplessness and growing desperation of soldiers who realized that their carefully planned assault had become a death trap. The German defensive scheme for Omaha Beach proved far more sophisticated and deadly than Allied intelligence had anticipated, with interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach route and pre-registered artillery concentrations that could instantly destroy any group of soldiers that attempted to advance inland from the beach. Danny wrote about the methodical efficiency with which enemy machine gunners engaged American troops, noting that the Germans seemed to know exactly where soldiers would seek cover and had positioned their weapons to eliminate any place of safety along the entire length of the landing zone. The carefully prepared defensive positions, many of them constructed from reinforced concrete and virtually immune to small arms fire, gave German forces overwhelming advantages that threatened to turn D-Day into a catastrophic Allied defeat. The casualties among American forces during the first hour of the Omaha Beach assault reached staggering proportions, with some companies losing more than 90% of their strength before they could advance more than a few yards from the water's edge. Danny documented the heartbreaking scenes of wounded soldiers calling for medics who were themselves dead or wounded, of officers trying to rally troops while bleeding from multiple wounds, and of entire squads wiped out by single bursts of machine gun fire that caught them in the open without adequate cover. The beach became littered with bodies, abandoned equipment, and the wreckage of landing craft that had been destroyed while attempting to reach shore with reinforcements and supplies. Perhaps most demoralizing was the realization that the extensive training and planning that had preceded the invasion seemed inadequate for the reality of combat against a determined enemy fighting from prepared positions. Danny wrote about the gap between theoretical knowledge gained during exercises and the practical challenges of leading men under fire, coordinating movement across terrain swept by enemy weapons, and maintaining unit cohesion when normal command structures had been destroyed by casualties. The radio procedures, tactical formations, and assault techniques that had worked perfectly during training proved almost useless when confronted with the intensity and chaos of actual combat. The turning point came gradually, as small groups of soldiers began finding ways to advance inland despite the overwhelming German fire that had pinned down the majority of the assault force. Danny observed individual acts of heroism by soldiers who crawled forward under fire to eliminate enemy positions, officers who exposed themselves to rally their men, and non-commissioned officers who took command when their superiors had been killed or wounded. These isolated successes began to create small footholds on the bluffs above the beach, providing protected positions from which American forces could begin systematically reducing the German strongpoints that had dominated the landing zone. By 0900 hours, Danny's position had become untenable as rising tide and continued German fire compressed the American foothold on Omaha Beach to a strip barely 100 yards deep. His notebook entry from this time reflected both exhaustion and determination, noting that despite horrific casualties and the apparent failure of the assault plan, individual soldiers and small units were continuing to fight and advance simply because surrender or retreat were not acceptable options. The turning tide, literally and figuratively, would soon force German defenders to choose between continuing their resistance and being overrun by American forces who had nowhere to go but forward. What do you think motivated these young American soldiers to continue fighting when their assault plan had failed and they faced almost certain death on a beach where the enemy held every advantage? The breakthrough that ultimately secured Omaha Beach came not from the execution of pre-planned tactics, but from the spontaneous courage of individual soldiers who refused to accept defeat despite overwhelming odds and catastrophic casualties. Danny O'Connor witnessed the beginning of this transformation at approximately 10:30 hours, when a mixed group of Rangers, infantry, and engineers began scaling the bluffs at a point where German defenses had been temporarily suppressed by naval gunfire directed by brave observers who had managed to establish communication with ships offshore. His notebook entry described watching soldiers climb vertical cliff faces under fire, using ropes, bayonets, and bare hands to reach German positions that had seemed impregnable just hours earlier. The key to breaking the deadlock on Omaha Beach proved to be the adaptability and initiative of American soldiers who improvised solutions to tactical problems that their training had not specifically addressed. Danny documented how demolition teams used Bangalore torpedoes and explosive charges to blast gaps through German wire obstacles and beach fortifications, creating narrow corridors through which small assault groups could advance toward enemy positions. These breaches were often sealed quickly by German counterattacks, but they provided sufficient distraction to allow other groups to find alternative routes inland, gradually expanding the American foothold despite fierce enemy resistance. The coordination between different elements of the assault force improved dramatically once small groups of soldiers reached the high ground above the beach and could begin directing naval gunfire against specific German positions. Danny's radio, jury-rigged with salvaged components from damaged equipment, became crucial in this effort as he helped coordinate fire missions that systematically destroyed the machine gun nests and artillery positions that had dominated the beach throughout the morning. The massive guns of Allied battleships and cruisers, guided by observers who could see their targets clearly for the first time, began inflicting devastating damage on German fortifications that had seemed invulnerable to direct assault. The human cost of the Omaha Beach victory was staggering, with American casualties eventually reaching over 2,400 killed and wounded on D-Day alone, making it the bloodiest single engagement for U.S. forces during the entire Normandy campaign. Danny wrote about the sobering experience of moving through areas that had been fought over earlier in the day, noting the density of American bodies and the evidence of desperate close-quarters combat that had characterized the struggle for each German position. Many of the dead were soldiers he had trained with for months, young men from small towns across America who had crossed an ocean to die on a French beach in the cause of freedom and democracy. By afternoon, the German defense of Omaha Beach had begun to collapse as American forces consolidated their foothold on the bluffs and began expanding inland toward objectives that had been scheduled for capture during the first hours of the invasion. Danny participated in the advance toward the village of Vierville-sur-Mer, noting the dramatic change in tactical situation as American forces moved from desperate defense to systematic offensive operations against German positions that were no longer mutually supporting. The transformation from near defeat to victory had taken less than 6 hours, but the cost in human lives would affect American families and communities for generations to come. The aftermath of the Omaha Beach assault revealed both the courage of American soldiers and the inadequacy of pre-invasion planning that had underestimated German defensive capabilities and overestimated the effectiveness of preliminary bombardments. Danny's notebook entries from the evening of June 6th reflected his mixed emotions about surviving the battle while so many of his comrades had not, expressing gratitude for American victory while mourning friends who would never see their families again. The successful establishment of a beachhead in Normandy had been achieved, but at a price that sobered even the most optimistic Allied commanders and demonstrated the true cost of defeating Nazi Germany. The consolidation phase that followed the initial Omaha Beach assault provided Danny O'Connor with his first opportunity to fully comprehend the magnitude of both American sacrifice and German defensive preparation that had made June 6, 1944, such a costly victory for Allied forces. As his unit moved inland during the evening hours, they encountered evidence of the sophisticated fortification system that German engineers had spent 4 years constructing along the Norman coast, including reinforced concrete bunkers, elaborate trench networks, and carefully positioned obstacles that had channeled American assault troops into predetermined killing zones. The fact that Allied forces had overcome these defenses represented a triumph of individual courage over military engineering, but the price paid for victory would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Danny's role as a radio operator gave him access to casualty reports and operational summaries that revealed the true scope of American losses during the D-Day landings, information that was kept from the general public for months after the invasion to maintain home front morale. His notebook entries from June 7th and 8th documented conversations with wounded soldiers being evacuated through the beachhead stations, many of whom expressed guilt about surviving when so many of their comrades had been killed during the assault. The psychological impact of witnessing mass casualties would prove as lasting as the physical wounds suffered by individual soldiers, creating a generation of veterans who carried emotional scars that never fully healed. The strategic success of Operation Overlord became apparent during the weeks following D-Day, as Allied forces expanded their Normandy beachhead and began the campaign that would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe and Nazi Germany's defeat. Danny participated in the advance towards Saint-Vith and the Cotentin Peninsula, noting the dramatic change in German defensive capabilities once American forces had broken out of the coastal fortifications and begun fighting in the hedgerow country of interior Normandy. The loss of the Atlantic Wall had forced German commanders to conduct a fighting retreat that, while still deadly for individual American soldiers, lacked the advantages that had made Omaha Beach such a formidable defensive position. The letters that Danny wrote to his family during the summer of 1944 revealed his struggle to explain experiences that seemed beyond civilian understanding, particularly the contrast between the heroic narrative of D-Day that was emerging in American media and the brutal reality of what had actually happened on Omaha Beach. He wrote about his difficulty reconciling pride in American victory with grief for friends who had died in the surf, noting that the successful invasion had been achieved through individual acts of courage rather than superior planning or overwhelming firepower. The gap between public perception and combat reality would become a recurring theme for World War II veterans who found that their actual experiences differed significantly from popular accounts of American military success. Danny's survival through the remainder of the European campaign included participation in the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final advance into Germany. But his notebook entries suggest that none of these subsequent operations affected him as profoundly as the events of June 6, 1944. The Omaha Beach assault had been his introduction to combat and had established patterns of behavior and emotional response that influenced his reaction to every subsequent battle. His detailed documentation of tactical procedures, casualty figures, and individual acts of heroism reflected both his technical training as a radio operator and his recognition that someone needed to bear witness to sacrifices that might otherwise be forgotten or misunderstood. Private First Class Danny O'Connor was discharged from the Army in December 1945 and returned to Chicago, where he found work as an electronics technician and married his high school sweetheart in a ceremony that included several other D-Day veterans who had survived the war. His notebook was kept in a trunk in his basement for nearly 40 years, during which time he rarely spoke about his combat experiences except with other veterans who had shared similar trauma. The discovery of his journal by French archaeologists in 1984 provided historians with one of the most complete first-person accounts of the Omaha Beach assault, offering insights into both the tactical challenges and emotional impact of what many consider the most important battle of World War II. Danny died in 1998 at the age of 73. Having lived long enough to see the Normandy beaches transformed from battlefields into memorial sites dedicated to preserving the memory of Allied sacrifice during D-Day. His notebook, now housed in the National D-Day Memorial in Virginia, serves as testimony to the courage of ordinary American soldiers who accomplished an extraordinary mission despite inadequate planning, fierce enemy resistance, and casualties that might have broken the spirit of less determined men. The final entry in his journal, written on the evening of June 6, 1944, captured both the exhaustion and pride of soldiers who had achieved the impossible. "We're in France to stay. The cost was terrible, but we're here and we're going to finish this war. For all the guys who didn't make it off the beach, we owe them that much." Today, Omaha Beach serves as a memorial to the 2,400 American casualties suffered during the D-Day landings and the thousands more who died during the subsequent Normandy campaign. The success of Operation Overlord opened the second front in Western Europe that would eventually lead to Nazi Germany's defeat. But that strategic victory was built on the individual sacrifices of soldiers like Danny O'Connor, who faced death on a foreign beach because they understood that freedom was worth any price. The lesson of Omaha Beach remains relevant for every generation, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they fight for principles greater than their own survival. Did you know that the casualty rate among first-wave assault troops on Omaha Beach exceeded 90% in some units? Yet American forces still managed to establish the foothold that would eventually lead to the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany?